another episode of Rappin with the Rep. I'm State Representative Ken Gordon. I'm here with Melisa Tintocalis, the Economic Development Director for the town of Burlington. And we're going to talk about Cambridge Street. We're going to spend this show talking about the repaving project that went on during the summer in Cambridge Street and some of the concern that was raised by residents about the way that this new road was striped after it was repaved. We're going to have Kris, who is the Director of Innovation for MassDOT, here later in the show, and he's going to also talk about the bike lanes that were put into place in the new repaving, you know, the painting that was done, why that is, and why that's done basically on a statewide basis when roads are repaved, when painting is put back in. But before we get there, I want to talk to you, Melisa, about essentially the decisions that were made and the extent to which Burlington, the town of Burlington, was involved in those decisions. So the road now is, in most of the way, is one lane in each direction, and with either a bike path or a bike lane, depending on the way it is. And before we get into our discussion, I just want to point out that I heard a lot of concern about the safety of a bike lane or a bike path, which is the difference being that for 1 mile of this road up towards Billerica, there's a green separate path for the bikes to go over on the side of the road. And then when you get from the high school up to that halfway point, there are these little bike icons. And you have to, the bicyclist would go into the lane of where the motorists are, right? So I took out my bike and I went and rode it to see just how you know, how much, what type of a concern that would be.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
I love that you did that.
Yeah, now I get that. Some people say, well, I wouldn't let my kids ride there. And it's not designed for children to play on Cambridge Street. It's designed as a commuter bikeway for people that might work at Leahy or someplace like that if they choose to travel that way, right? So, so we have that, and we're going to talk to MassDOT about why we do that. Okay. From your point of view, though, talk to me about what led up to the decisions that were made to have this road essentially, except for the intersections, they're basically one lane each direction with bike access.
Yeah. Well, I mean, from an economic development perspective, I mean, I think at a higher level, you know, we want to be a community that is attractive. Has, you know, people-friendly streets, has access to our businesses and the places where, you know, life unfolds, right? And I don't think, you know, from the town's perspective, one thing that has come up over the years is that, you know, we don't want to be some pass-through community that we're just rushing through to another spot. We want to be a destination. And part of that is access. How do you improve access, and not just with a car, but in different forms? You know, how do you keep our streets safe? How do you allow people to move around? And not just exclusively with a car. Although, you know, we're not trying to envision a car-free world. We are trying to make accommodations, and with the paving, with the area that we have. So, you know, with the town, MassDOT had engaged the business owners, town officials, and town staff to see how we could best address this opportunity, because they were coming in to repave. But also, you know, look at the data and see where, you know, we had some pain points on accidents and unsafe conditions that could be improved. And that's kind of what you're talking about, what led to the enhancements on Cambridge Street.
Yeah, in fact, we met a few years ago at True North.
Yep.
And we talked about, okay, what can we do? Because like you said, this is an opportunity. The road will be repaved one way or the other. And I know a lot of people have opinions, and those opinions differ from among folks who live here. And that's the way it should be, right? We live in a democracy, and people have a right to their opinion, but a decision has to be made. And the irony of meeting at True North is that's just one of those places where the traffic can get heavy and fast. And fast. And I do office hours there, and I can't, there were several times where I heard collisions, fender benders. Cars aren't going that fast, but cars pull in front of other cars, and it can be dangerous.
Yeah.
And we've had some drivers come and say, we need to slow it down so that I can kind of get into the roadway.
Right.
And from the point of view of business, I would think they're saying it's just easier for cars to get in and out of our parking lot if the cars in the road were going in such a way that it gave us that, if there's a break in the traffic, we can get in there.
Yes, yes. I mean, I think that's, I want to acknowledge that. I mean, it's a transition, right? What we kind of experienced on Cambridge Street, from kind of a quick moving, in some ways unorganized system of traffic that we had, and we tried with the best to really try to use the striping, to organize the traffic for safety, and then we were able to put in some bike lanes where it was comfortable and without doing eminent domains and takings.
Right.
We really tried to fix in some of those accommodations so that it made the whole stretch safer. And I know that that transition to kind of more modes of traffic is different for people. It's uncomfortable. It may appear that there's some delays, but I think collectively the overall stretch, working with MassDOT, working with our town engineers, has really been a safer environment for folks because it's slower and there's more visibility. And I have heard and through the process, we did reach out to businesses and property owners along the stretch, and they're there all the time, right? They can see the cars going by, they see some of the accidents or the close calls, oftentimes are just the close calls.
Right.
And so their voice was also folded into the process in terms of, making these changes. So that was part of it.
Yeah, this show was sort of months in the making because the folks that see the video of me on the bike are going to show it was in the summer.
Oh.
It took me some time to get someone from MassDOT to come in and talk to us. So therefore, having been months in the making, have you heard much of a result of people have had a little opportunity to get used to the road? From my use of the road, it doesn't look like we have traffic jams. It doesn't look like the traffic pattern has, it doesn't look like there have been problems that were created by the striping, at least from what I see.
Yeah,
what have you seen?
I mean, I think anecdotally through because my office is in the select board's office, so we initially heard we had more calls and complaints of why the change, but if that is kind of our initial reaction to the transition to this kind of the striping, it has died down. We have not had as many calls or concerns as much. In terms of engineering and MassDOT, and they've been monitoring it to make sure that I would say what they have in place is not exacerbated traffic anymore. So they're conscious of that, and so that has been part of the analysis. So that's ongoing still.
Yeah, and that's really the point, because traffic was bad going, for example, to the light on Bedford Street.
Yes.
Coming from the highway. That's been the case. This wouldn't quiet that down because there are just as many cars going. It just didn't exacerbate it either, I don't think.
Well, that's what the engineers and the traffic counts are indicating. So I think that's been a positive part of it. I think also, when we talk about economic development, again, from that lens, we want to have safe, accessible, livable spaces and sections in this commercial corridor is really kind of our neighborhood serving lines. A lot of residents come through. There's a lot of neighborhood serving businesses along this corridor, and so from that perspective of keeping things attractive and safe and staying competitive. I mean, this is not something we're just doing alone. Communities that are trying to draw people are very attentive to multimodal and safe walking conditions. So they want just a few other ways other than a car to move around our spaces, and that's another element that doesn't really get talked about as much because it's a little more, it seems a little bit more, I guess, soft in a way, but it's a real factor as people consider places to locate.
Yeah, we have businesses in our area that employ people who don't want a car, who don't have a car and don't want a car. A lot of young people coming out of school, whether it's high school or college, just want to live in that way. And so the opportunity for them when they're looking for work to have a place they could, for example, take a bike when it's appropriate is, I think, important.
Exactly, when it's appropriate. And I think, you know, I like to think of it as car light because it might, you know, we're not expecting people to ditch their cars,
Right.
you know, I think, but if there's a couple things that you can do, either, you know, walk, you know, the 20 minutes or bike a 15-minute, like to get to a few activities or things that you need, ideally that's a safe, you want safe areas to do that. And at this point in time, you know, at least for this project, that was the most cost-effective and upgrade that we could do to, you know, make some of that happen. So.
Yeah.
I was encouraged by the effort. I know, again, that other people have felt differently, but I felt like it's a step in the right direction to make accommodations for all types of transportation.
Yeah, I know that there were hearings, there were public hearings. People had an opportunity to
Yes.
express their opinion, but a decision had to be made.
Exactly.
And it's been years that this particular project was one that engendered opinions that differed from each other.
Yes.
Many people came to me and said everybody thinks, and they would tell me something, but then some other person would come 5 minutes later and say everybody thinks the other thing. And
Yeah.
that's what happens in government.
Yes.
And that's fair
Yes.
because people come in with that perspective. But eventually, the road had to be striped one way or the other, had to be painted one way or the other. And as we said, I look at this from the point of view of all of, like you said, those small businesses along Cambridge Street going towards Billerica. Is it easier now for the cars to access those businesses? Do they see that? Because prior to the striping, prior to the paving, I think that much of it was a result of the paint having been worn away.
Yeah, that's a good point. You know, it's much clearer now because even the bus stops are a lot more clear. You know, like where buses are going to, you know, pause. You know, at least, you know, where some of the lanes to travel in are a lot more organized for folks to go down. I think something which surprised me, and I don't know if you heard this, in terms of some folks thought that should extend actually. Or why haven't you done it more at the high school or more even further along? Because that's where they've experienced, you know, that perceived two lanes
Right.
getting very dangerous. Again, a lot of close calls that we don't, you know, they don't record as accidents because they're just close calls, but that's kind of scary driving, especially, you know, with our high school students walking, driving in that area. So that has come to my attention to see, like, you know, are we going to explore this more? So I don't know if that's on MassDOT's radar. As you know, I don't know, you can talk to MassDOT. I haven't talked to them specifically about that. But, you know, in the areas where the striping has occurred, you know, the businesses, I know probably two anecdotally have said that it's been it's at least easier for their clients to come in and out of some of the egress because most of them are strip malls, right?
Right.
So you have a couple of the curb cuts that are now a little bit safer, at least anecdotally have said that's been the case.
Yeah, and that
So-
would make sense.
Yeah.
This started as routine road maintenance
Yes.
for MassDOT. They're going to repave
Yep.
eventually, and they're going to repave the side that goes toward Woburn eventually too, because that comes up regularly. And then at that point, they'll make their decision with the town, as you said, as to what's the best way to do that as well. Knowing that, and we'll hear from our next segment with Kris Carter, that when these repaving, resurfacing projects happen, they'll make accommodations for a bike path or a bike lane as necessary,
Yep.
just as they did this part, because that's the method that's being used now.
Yeah, it's I think that working with MassDOT, I know that the town of Burlington also is sitting on the MPO, which is the Metropolitan Planning Organization, and we have a seat at the table representing kind of the North Suburban Planning Council. That's kind of a collection of the communities. And I think it's good for us to be there because the other thing I've heard related to this is just the town center. Why can't we, improve also the landscape of, not the landscape necessarily, the streetscape with, certain lights or, the land use changes. And I know that has been factored in, and being part of the MPO, we can advocate for that for funding in the future to make maybe more infrastructure enhancements that are more costly than the striping, and we're now at the table for that too.
Right.
So we're being more proactive and being more involved as well. So as much as it's been a great collaboration, I think, with MassDOT in getting the initial kind of, I would say, more short-term improvements done, we're hoping to do, more enhancements for the street, longer term, being on the MPO and getting maybe tip money for that too.
Well, that's great. That you're right. There are opportunities that present themselves through this work and through our work into the future. So, Melissa, thank you very much for coming on to Rappin
Thanks
with
for
the Rap.
having me, Ken.
Thank you. What we're going to do next is we're going to go to a Zoom interview that we conducted just a week ago or so with Kris Carter from MassDOT. So sit tight. Here we go with that. Hi, everybody. We are back, and we are talking with Kris Carter, who is the Chief Innovations Officer at MassDOT. And we're going to talk about what goes into designing a road, and also we can talk a little bit about Cambridge Street, which is what brings us here into this conversation today. So thank you, Kris, for being here with us. So we're talking about a state road that goes through the heart of the business district, commercial district in Burlington, and it's a road that was repaved last summer. When it was repaved, it was eventually repainted, restriped, and in doing so, we ended up with a design that was essentially 2 lanes of traffic going in each direction, except for at the intersections where it branches out. And there's a bike lane, there's a bike path in half of it, bike lanes in the other. So can we start talking about what goes into the decision by MassDOT to include bike lanes in a road that is in the center of a town?
Sure, yeah. So broadly speaking, MassDOT, through the Beyond Mobility 2050 plan, is really focused on how do we move not just cars, but move people, right? So when we went around and talked to all the people across the state to develop that plan that sort of sets the vision for the Commonwealth, it's about moving people in safe ways, giving them lots of travel choices, not just car travel choices. So that might be a bike, sidewalks, that kind of things. We know they are essential links for getting people to work and to school, transit services, medical appointments, whatever that might be. And so an investment in bicycle infrastructure, an investment in pedestrian infrastructure, actually sort of provides additional benefits to our community because it is all about sort of providing those safe connections beyond the car. When it goes into designing an actual project, there's lots of considerations that come up for those engineers and planners that work on those specific projects. And so sometimes they're making trade-off decisions on different parts of a roadway, depending on what is available, what sort of funding is there, how they scope that project, the extent of it, whether they're going to be doing some takings of land to sort of expand something. And I think for this project, it was sort of designed as a resurfacing project. Which means you're kind of constrained into the space you already have. In a lot of cases, then you're looking about, okay, well, how do we make sure that we can keep vehicle traffic flowing? And how do we improve the safety of that roadway as well? What kind of accommodations can we make for people that are walking and biking? And this is really tied to not just the Beyond Mobility 2050 plan, but the Healthy Transportation Directive from 2013. It's been around for a very long time. It makes it clear that every roadway should serve all users. And when you get into that design part of it, you're then going to have to make probably some trade-offs about, where you're prioritizing what to make sure the roadway can function. In some cases, right, adding that bicycle facility takes a roadway that is, this wide and sort of shrinks it down a little bit. And that can actually have some real safety benefits for everybody, not just the person maybe that's on a bike, but also for the vehicular traffic there too. So people in cars that maybe a road was sort of a little bit too wide for one lane and people were squeaking by in two and it was really unclear, but it kind of made things unsafe. That actually can improve the safety for people driving. It can slow down some speeds sometimes that become problems, not during sort of those peak hours of travel where speeds might be faster because there's a wider roadway. And you get the healthy sort of transportation benefits, better things for the climate by adding those bicycle and pedestrian accommodations on the sides of that roadway.
So I noticed I've explained to the viewers that I took out my bicycle, I rode the 2 miles of this road, and I noticed that in one half of this road, the half that's the east part, there are small icons along the travel lanes, a little icon of a bicyclist, and I'm showing the viewers now what that looks like. Those that have traveled here in Burlington on that road have seen it, I think. But I also notice now that you see that icon in most every state roadway on a town and city, and some other town roadways. You see that icon in the travel lane. So how did that begin, and what's the experience of MassDOT with that? Essentially, is it a safe way to go?
Yeah, I think the icons you're talking about are sometimes referred to as sharrows, which is really a signal to everybody that we are sharing that road. It is not just for car or truck travel, it is for bikes as well. The best case scenario, you have a road that's wide enough that you add a beautiful shared use path off to the side of it and people can walk and bike and it's very comfortable. We don't have a lot of roadways that can accommodate that, right? That takes a lot of space and you got to redesign things, and often there's buildings that are there, and so that's not going to happen in most places. So those sharrows are a way to say to everybody, hey, slow down here. We're sharing this road. It is a symbol that is in something called the MUTCD, the Manual for Uniform Traffic Control Devices. That comes from the federal government. States implement that. And that means that that symbol you see here and on this roadway, you should see in New Hampshire and Vermont and Maine and Wyoming, right? It's the same symbol, and it is signifying to drivers that this is a space where you should expect to see cyclists on the roadway. You should respect and make sure you're passing appropriately if you need to, or giving them the space in that lane to make sure that they can travel safely as well.
It looked like my little review of this was that historically federal funding has been tied to accepting these types of programs when we create our roads. Has that been the case here in Massachusetts?
It's certainly true that states and MassDOT has to follow sort of this guidance from the federal government on what types of markings go on the roadway, and that does, that states are supposed to follow those and get the funding to make sure that they're implementing in that way. I think Massachusetts does a great job of really thinking through these challenges of how do we get more bicycle infrastructure and pedestrian infrastructure into our projects, because we really want people for those short trips to be able to move in different ways that maybe don't require a car. And as a state, we do a really great job of trying to include that in the projects and working with cities and towns as they're designing their roads as well to make sure they're thinking that through, and we're sort of assessing or making sure that we aren't taking that out of the project unless it's absolutely necessary for some reason.
These markings on the road exist, and when we deal with a kind of a busy road in a commercial end, it would look to me like what you would expect was that these were for commercial bicyclists to use, if at all. In other words, the state's not encouraging children on roads like this, I would imagine, right?
Yeah, I think, I have 2 kids. I bike them around the streets of Boston where we live. But I do it, I have routes that I find that are preferable for our family, and routes that I ride as a commuter that I probably wouldn't bring them on at the age that they're at. So I would say that is up to, parents to make that judgment for where they feel safe riding with their children. The reason you put those sharrows out there is because we want cyclists to feel like this road is available to them, and we want drivers to make sure that they are aware that they should expect to see cyclists on that roadway. It often comes with some signage too, right? That's up usually, that's sort of making sure that people see that share the road sign or the 4-foot passing sign in some places.
Thank you for that. I know you weren't directly involved with the Burlington project, but I think you have reviewed the file on it. Are you aware, did Burlington did Burlington, the town of Burlington, have a say? Were they involved in the design of the painting of the road with MassDOT?
Yeah, you're right. Not a project that I was involved in or did any of the project management with, and that fell on some other teams at MassDOT and it predates my time there. From what I can tell, it looks like there was a collaborative effort between MassDOT and the town to sort of come up with a plan that worked best for the community. It looked like there was a number of community meetings on it to talk about where that striping was going to be and how it best sort of fit the needs that they were hearing from people. And looks like it even went through a couple different iterations of that striping plan as well, based on community feedback around traffic and some traffic counts that went into that as well.
Is that sort of standard operating procedure for MassDOT when working with, as opposed to a big highway, but when you're working with a road that goes through a town, does it work with the town in coming up with a plan that's agreeable to both?
Yeah. The highway engineers that work on those projects often work hand in hand with the community, and usually some design consultants as well that are involved, and that was the case here. Very common to sort of raise up some of the data that MassDOT has access to, whether that's some of the crash data that we have, or to sort of help with the scoping of the extent of that project and some of the project financing that then can impact what ends up on the roadway. But it's always a collaborative effort, with communities and making sure that people are traveling safely, because that's sort of, MassDOT's main mission is that, people are getting around the Commonwealth safely in a timely manner, making sure that, they can get their business done and that we don't slow down commerce as well. But safety is number one. And, there's a lot of data sets and a lot of teams at MassDOT that spend time thinking about that and how we make sure that communities have access to that information and can make good decisions too.
Yeah, it's interesting with this roadway, and you bring this up. MassDOT took the opportunity of a resurfacing that was maintenance. It had to be done. And then, okay, now we've got to restripe it one way or the other. And historically, there are people who, the striping, if it existed at all, and it was somewhat worn off, so it was vague as to whether this was wide enough to allow someone to pass one place or another. And now the striping makes it clear. Not everyone is happy, but some are. A decision had to be made, it looks like.
Yeah, I think that is often the case, right? Like bike lanes make driving safer and easier too. They're not just for the cyclists. So that striping plays a big role for everybody. And in places where you have often they talk about a cross section. How far across is that roadway? And there's some guidance, that MassDOT has and the federal government has about how narrow those lanes can be. And if you end up in a place where you've got, 2 lanes and like a little extra, striping can play a role in how you sort of move those vehicles safely through there, because a wider space and more asphalt means that sometimes cars will travel, beyond what the speed should be for that roadway, and that can create some safety challenges. I imagine, the engineers on this project went and looked at some of that safety data to see if crashes were happening or not, as well as sort of community input. And you don't have to go far on the internet, and there's Reddit threads on this about this roadway talking about, is it 1 lane, is it 2 lane? And people have all kinds of thoughts, whether it's 1 or 2, and stories about being sideswiped or being nervous about this or that. I think that striping plays a role in sort of hopefully reducing that confusion, as well as just making it safer for everybody out there.
I think it does. Kris, thank you very much for being here with Rapping with the Rep. Thanks for the explanation, and thanks for your time.
Yeah, happy to chat with you, Rep.
Thank you
Take
very
care.
much. Folks, thank you for tuning in. This was a little bit of an unusual episode of Rapping with the Rep. I got to make some use of my bicycle and get out there because I wanted to see firsthand what the experience would be like in riding the bike lanes and the bike path on the road, and to see that when I rode the dedicated lane, it was, to me, it was perfectly safe. And when I rode the portion of the road where I had to come into traffic, I certainly had to look for the patience of the motorists behind me to let me get in. But then I also got out of the traffic as soon as I could, as most cyclists would, making use of that road as, at that point, a commuter access road. And I know it took some time. I know on social media we posted that we would do this with the use of the bicycle. I know that was a few months ago, but I'm glad that I was able to get Kris Carter from MassDOT to eventually and finally come in and talk to us about the state's perspective on restriping this road and other roads, and the town's perspective through Melisa Tintocalis of the involvement that the town had in the project. And your involvement. Thank you very much for coming to me with your concerns, whether they're reflected in this project or whether they weren't. I took all of your concerns into account when I talked to MassDOT, as I always will. So thank you for coming and tuning into another episode of Rappin with the Rep. I'll see you next time.